Lo siento mucho, pero mi español es no que bueno. Pero tengo mi diapositivas traducidas en español, ¿ok? So, this morning what I wanted to talk to you about was network attack, and specifically advanced persistent threat, APT. So there's a lot of different definitions for that, so we probably should start with just understanding what exactly we're talking about here. And today's talk will be specifically at the network level. Obviously there's many facets of security, physical security, endpoint security. Verizon's data breach report this year represented that 35% of data breaches involved some sort of physical incursion. So certainly don't forget the basics of, guards and card readers and those kinds of things. But today, we're going to focus specifically on network security. I'm with Palo Alto Networks, and I wanted to thank Mike Price for inviting us down here, and my companion in Chile, Patricio Campos, who's here with us. So, what I've got for you is we've done some research earlier this year in March. We did across 3 months and about 1,000 customer networks that have our equipment. So we gathered some information on how these advanced persistent threats behave. And when I say advanced threat, I'm not talking about the nuisance threat. I'm talking about targeted, directed attacks that are looking to steal valuable information. This is a threat to your intellectual property. This is a threat to your company's survival. And in some cases, it is a threat to national security or a threat to the ongoing economy of an entire nation. So not talking about the low-level threats. Certainly there are many, many tools out there. Lots of people talk about that. We want to focus just on those very top, most difficult and advanced threats. And we'll do that using some of the statistics that we found, which I think you may be surprised at some of the findings there. And then from those statistics, I'd like to help build some best practices, some ideas that you can take back to your companies to try to stop these threats, or at least keep these threats from persisting or living in your network for long periods of time. Because that's what we're finding, is that these threats can make their way into your environment, go undetected for many, many months, sometimes years, and constantly be stealing from you. So to do this, I think it's important that we look at the typical life cycle of a network threat. And every time I see this chart, it reminds me that the security industry tends to have a mentality that's ingrained, that says, okay, a new threat shows up, we need some new tool, some new process to stop that threat. And I like to simplify it more, because it's not necessarily true that you have to have a new tool, you spend more money just because there's some new threat. When you think about it across the life cycle and we make it as simple as possible, you may see that there are some easier ways to deal with what is very, very much a complex problem. So for instance, step one of a typical attack, for instance, maybe a spear phishing email. So we have tools for that, right? We have spam blockers. We have email antivirus. Okay, great. You look at step two, where there's going to be an exploit sent to the machine. Again, many, many tools to look for this. Traditional intrusion prevention systems, IPS. They look at phase 2 and phase 3. They're looking for payloads. They're looking for the actual malicious code. And moving into the next stage where you've established this back door, now is when the cyber attacker is building an infrastructure inside of your environment so that they can continue to operate. And this infrastructure requires that they're able to communicate outside of your network to a command and control network of their own or to other tools so that they can bring additional tools down. And so for any of the hackers in the room, sorry if I'm breaking all your secrets. But this is what we've observed. And so, IPS looks at stage 2, stage 3. But if you're going to try to stop stage 4 and 5, It takes even more tools. Data loss prevention, specific, sandboxing tools, security platform. So when does it stop? When can we stop thinking about it this way, where every time there's a new threat, we need a new tool? So what I'd like to do is take a different approach to this, okay? And if you'll bear with me, think of malware like as if it was a garden. If you've ever grown a garden, a vegetable garden, you grow flowers, okay? Any plant that's growing in your garden that you don't want is called what? A weed, or it's a bad plant, right? So you want to kill it, you want to remove it. It's still a plant, though, is it not? It still needs sunlight and water, just like your flowers, just like your vegetables. So think of that same analogy in malware. Malware is just another application. It just happens to be one that you don't want in your network. So when we look at the advanced threat, the top-level threat, not the one that has been floating around on Pastebin, not the one that you can pull out of Backtrack, the one that is custom developed. And this is what we're finding, is that they don't just write the custom malware, but every phase of the attack is customized. This is how they circumvent security. This is how you spend all this money on IPS and antivirus and firewalls, but yet you still get infected. Because this level of attacker customizes everything. So we talk about customization of the application itself, customization of the payload, and customization of the domains or the networks that transport. So you could say that an advanced attack is simply the coordination of these three things to keep it as simple as possible. Now, when you think about customized applications, what we have found in our research is that if you find unknown traffic on your network, it is generally significant in some way or another. Meaning, it's either that you have a custom in-house application, perhaps that your own coders wrote, or maybe it's a brand new commercial application that just hit the market and you deploy this, and it's unknown. But if it's not one of those two, generally it's malware, because everything can be classified on your network. And that's one of the things we'll talk about here in a minute. Certainly, the customization extends to the command and control traffic. You can take existing applications and customize and change those. Instant Messenger being morphed. You've seen like the Flame virus in Syria and in Iran, where they took Skype and they modified it so they could spy on their own citizens. Another key fact that we see in the customization of applications is the fact that they do not use standard ports. And this brings me to another very significant point, I think, because we all spend a lot of time with tools that are built around port classification. We believe that port classification is no longer adequate for network traffic in general, because evasion has become the norm, and port hopping, using multiple ports for protocols that don't belong on that particular port has become very, very common. The research report that we did earlier this year is called the Modern Malware Review. This is something that if you would like a copy of the report, it's available. You can see me after the presentation or see Patricio, and we've got copies of this. But one of the pieces of information that came from this was that unknown UDP, for instance, it only represented a very, very small portion of overall bandwidth on these 1,000 networks that we studied. 2%, less than 2%. But that little bit of 2% had over half of the malware was in there. So that's very significant. Very small piece of the traffic, very hidden, nobody looks for it, but yet that's where the bad things were, the serious bad things. So the same is true when you look at the payload, the actual exploit, the actual malicious code, customized. Customized with a shelf life of maybe a few days. So time becomes a big factor in an advanced attack. Anyone can block a virus that's been out on the market for 30 days, 2 months, a year. You should be able to anyway. But it is these brand new ones, these customized ones, that are the most difficult, and those are the ones that will get around your security. So we find that one of the ways that they do this, one of the ways that they customize the malware is to polymorphism or polyinstantiation, which is to say a slight modification to the file. If you simply add another 0 to the binary, simply add another character to the tail end of a binary. It doesn't change the core code, but what does it change? It changes the hash value, changes the file name perhaps. These are very easy ways to circumvent security, yet the core code is the same. We found actually, of all the malware that we've located in this study, 40% of it was not actually original at all. It was simply a variant of some other previously written malware. So it comes down to a question of efficiency on how you're going to do your analysis on these malware items. Now, we have a sandbox technology that we use called Wildfire, and that detonates these files and observes their behaviors. And that's one of the key ways that we found as much as we did, that would have otherwise bypassed security. In that, we found that over half, like 50 to 70% of the new forms of malware that we located had no antivirus coverage from any of the major AV vendors. So again, it's very clear that this is how traditional security is so easily bypassed. And when it comes to the new domains and the customized domains, this is the transport. This is how the malware communicates, and it's very complex. Fast flux domains or domain generation algorithms, where literally DNS records are changed, like frequency hopping, if anybody here has a background in RF radio. If you're able to change frequencies every second, it's really tough to intercept that radio signal and make sense of what you've got. So malware writers have adapted to this same technique on the DNS front. Now, all of these things are scary and difficult to analyze, yes, but they also give us indicators of where these are happening. And that's one of the tools that you will find that you can use to locate these in your own network, is signs and indicators of compromise that reflect things like fast flux domain activity, unusual DNS, domain generation algorithms. So I'd like to walk through some of the key information, the statistics that we generated from this report earlier this year, and then from that come to some conclusions on how we might form some best practices to stop these things. One of the observations that we found across malicious activity on these networks that we studied, number one item, unknown TCP or UDP. So traffic that was not able to be classified was number one for where the bad things were. Second thing was the unregistered domain. So this confirms our very simple model we have of customized, applications, payloads, domains. Absolutely, unregistered domains were a clear indicator of compromise again and again, and those two were the top two. There's some other ones there if you want to see those. Another interesting find in terms of how do these actual payloads circumvent your security. The number one way we found was called long sleep. It's basically, if you've got antivirus, it is a process and it attaches to a file, yes? So if you don't do anything, you sit still for hours, days, maybe even weeks, and you don't do anything, the antivirus can't continually hold that file. That process has to release its hooks at some point, otherwise it'll consume all your system resources. Malware writers know this, so they simply, it's like a guessing game. How long can I wait? Well, I can wait as long as you are looking at me, and when you stop looking at me, then I will behave bad. This was the number one form of avoidance from traditional malware. And we see some other behaviors, deleting itself or simply injecting code elsewhere so that no longer it's under view. When it comes to the persistence part, APT, right? The P means persistence, meaning it's not smash and grab. You don't just break in, steal something, and leave. You break in, you're quiet, you're stealth, and then you try to live there for a long time. Well, how do they live there for a long time without detection? I mean, we all have all this security. How is it that they can do that? Some of the top ways we found: simply copying itself. That's an old trick, right? That's the definition of a virus, is something that copies itself. But some other trickier ones were things like masquerading as a Windows systems program. You know, if WinINI is an accepted file on your system, but it's really not WinINI, you know, then it's not being looked at, so it can live there for long periods of time. And one other key point to the persistence is the ability for these items to communicate out to the network, the command and control. Because just like your Java needs updates and Adobe needs updates and, of course, Microsoft, so does the malware. They run their operation similarly. Update the code, modify the code, change hash values, constant change, constant motion, or, you know, in some cases, constant hiding. And then this part really, you know, every time my browser asks me if I want to save a password, I think about this statistic. Because when it comes to the final phase of this, where they are stealing your data, the number one activity that happens first is steal the passwords out of the browser. Because that's a very, very easy way to escalate privileges. You know, if I've got even a couple of your passwords to some other websites, I can put those passwords into my dictionary attack, and I'll bet you, even if your core password is somewhat different, it's probably enough alike that I can easily crack your password now. And when you can consider that these are easy to dump out, small files, hash values are sent out, and then once they're sent away, then we can start working on cracking them. Once I've got a good set of credentials, that's what will allow me to move laterally within your network, switch subnets as the administrator, take over machines as administrator, and get root. So not terribly new findings, but I wanted to point these out because specifically these are the kinds of things, these are specifically the infections that did not have antivirus coverage and how they behaved. So I wanted you to see some of this. Now this was another interesting point. I mentioned before that the game comes down to time, because the malware writers know that they only have a handful of days, maybe a week. In this case, we found on average 5 days for email-borne threats before the security industry had signatures out there. 20 days on web. Now, I'm not really sure what the significance of that is. You know, it could mean that email protection mechanisms have gotten better, or more likely, it's pointing to the preferred vector for malware writers being web traffic. And I think when you look at this next piece, it confirms that. So by far, the web vector, browsing, was the greatest threat vector still. And again, this is not news to anybody here. In fact, this is where a lot of your tools you have today focus. And you know, from the 68,000 files that we found on using the wildfire technology, there were a good 26,000 of those that had no antivirus coverage at the time of their discovery. So what this points to is that there is a sharp rise in the sophistication and the organization of the attackers at this level. And they have the resources. Many of them are nation-state backed. Many of them are backed by wealthy crime families or syndicates that have money, because it costs money to write this kind of customized code. So you're dealing with well-funded, well-organized adversaries, not just the kid in the basement, with a copy of Backtrack. Now, before we leave this graphic, on this right graphic here, you see that little teeny sliver for FTP, just the purple? Just remember that for later, okay? Now, when it comes to evasion, we found some techniques were by far more popular as far as how to evade security. First and foremost was to use non-standard ports. Again, port and protocol are no longer adequate classification mechanisms when you consider how abused they are. The second was the ability to tunnel through permitted protocols. So again, without, if you simply look at a piece of traffic, port 53, DNS. Oh, okay, great, let it in. Well, is it DNS? And is it coming over port 53? Well, is the DNS also carrying additional data in the end of that file? Those are some of the ways that you can embed your malware into a known accepted application so that it doesn't even get inspected half the time. And the last piece was just anonymizers and proxies. It's very popular. Everyone knows that if you want to get around your company's firewall, just proxy around it. And it's tough to stop that, isn't it? Because that traffic's typically encrypted. So again, encryption is another key place that we'll talk about here in a second. Now, you remember that little purple sliver we talked about, the FTP? I think this was interesting because, that's not interesting at all. That is. Nobody cares about FTP. Nobody thinks about it. But we have to tell you, it wins the award this year for most evasive application. And this is very fresh data from earlier this year. What do I mean by that? 95% of the malware that we located in FTP was not covered by any antivirus. So, of the advanced attacks that we located, 95% of the FTP traffic fell into that advanced category versus something that was a rehash or, like a variant. Even greater, 97% of the sessions, the FTP sessions that were carrying malware, didn't use port 21. We tracked 237 different ports that FTP used. So you may not think FTP is very interesting. I certainly didn't before I saw the statistic either. It's one of those things. But it is absolutely a vital part for how advanced attackers are moving files, moving data. So we looked at some of the statistics. We looked at some of the realities of how customized and advanced attacks are making their way into our networks. So now let's switch gears and let's talk about some techniques, some ideas on how you might be able to stop them. And, I don't care whose products you use. Actually, I really care whose products you use. But let me say this. We're not the only security company, and there are many good ones. So my suggestion here is, whether it's our products or anybody else's, I want to give you some ideas on things that you should make sure that this product does, or it's not worth the money at all. You might as well not buy anything. First and foremost, and again, I take a very complex problem, I try to make it as simple as possible. So there's 5 little steps here, right? Number 1, it all has to go in the funnel. When you have side doors, why should I build a big front wall if I've got a nice, easy gate over here that you can walk right in? So this is a concept that we'll kind of touch on a little more. But I think the first step to truly being able to protect yourself from advanced threats and their persistence in your network is to reduce the attack surface. There's so much data flying. If you have 1,000 users, 10,000 users, that's a lot of information. How do you manage the security when it's just one little guy that's making its way in? Step 1, complete visibility across all ports and all protocols. It's critical. Again, whoever's equipment you use to do that, you need to be able to see. If you cannot see it, how can you stop it? So that's the first step. How do you do this? How do you constrict the attack surface so that you can have a manageable set of data to look at? One good way, block non-authorized applications. We talked about ways to circumvent security, anonymizers, Tor, Onion, easy ways, right? Block them. Simple. There's no legitimate use for that on your network. Don't let it happen at all. And we mentioned before that evasion has become the norm. It's not an exception. Even applications that are not malicious use evasion. Skype is a great example. If I send a Skype call to you, the first step that occurs is Skype sends a recon, like kind of a drone, if you will. It port scans you. If it doesn't find that my default port is open, the one it wants to use, it will find any open port and then use that one to open the call. Now, we like this. We like this because this means that Skype will work more often than not. But that is evasion, you know? So evasion's not always bad. It is the norm. So you have to expect the evasion and prepare for it. And to do that, that's where you have to put aside 20 years of thinking port and protocol and think in a new direction. Think at a full stack direction. One other big one. I never cease to be amazed. I work with companies all over the world. And I would say, I don't know, 8 or 9 out of 10 do nothing to inspect SSL traffic. Again, if you're going to spend all this money, you're going to spend all this time, you're going to hire these people to do the security, why would you leave the door open? It doesn't make sense. If you're doing nothing to inspect your SSL encrypt, and by the way, SSH too, your encrypted traffic needs to be decrypted and inspected. Now, I realize some countries, there's privacy laws, so perhaps selective decryption is one technique you can use there. Not giving administrators a clear text view, not taking clear text out of a particular device and sending it somewhere else. There's definitely some things you need to be concerned about when you're going about decryption. But when a typical network is made up of 25 to 45% SSL traffic, to not open that up is to basically leave a wide open door, not only for bad things to come in, but for all your data to go right out the door. That's the number one mechanism. And there's one other piece I want to mention on that. If you are in the market or you look at solutions to do SSL decryption, there's one other key thing that I think is important here. Because and I don't know if there's any hackers in the room. Any? If I find out as a hacker that you are now decrypting and inspecting SSL traffic, what's the next thing I do? I throw custom encryption at you. Once again, customization is the key to the advanced attack. Just like, if it's easy and you don't look at SSL, great, I'll just use SSL because that's very easy, it's common. But if you are looking at the SSL, I'll throw custom encryption. So any solution that you may look at to actually do this decryption and inspection needs to be able to also block unknown algorithms. Otherwise, again, there will be that, you will lose the race against the advanced attacker. And last but not least, on the idea of reducing attack surface, I think it's very important to share this concept with you. I call it a logical perimeter. And all this means is, extending the same levels of security that you may have at your headquarters to your remote users, your mobile device, your partners, your supply chain. We have seen again and again that, the most well-defended organizations, sometimes they're too tough to get into. But if I can break into your computer supplier, or if I can break into your customer, who you have a shared connection with, a trusted connection, there's your side door. So the extension of a logical perimeter is to say, distributing that same level of security to your extremities. This one is pretty straightforward. And this is where we spend a lot of our time today. So I won't spend too much time on this, but there's a few things I want to point out. The idea that block whatever you can. All the bad things that we know are bad, block. Now, again, it's oversimplified, but to be able to successfully do this, I believe it really requires an integrated security platform. Because just because one system knows a bad thing, maybe the other system does not. Maybe your web security knows this is bad, but your email security doesn't, or vice versa. So again, if you have separate solutions for each, great, you need those to talk to each other. Or if you have an integrated solution, make sure that the little pieces inside of that integrated solution talk to each other. And what I mean by talk to each other is they are contributing threat intelligence directly and automatically to the other functions. That's what I mean by integration. Okay, block, cargos malicios, yes, great. Exploits, we know this, right? All the known exploits, we don't want them. The command and control traffic, though, is a big one. This is how you can sever the tie. So even if you have an infection inside of your environment, If you can block the command and control traffic from making its way back out, yet again, another thing that a lot of folks don't think about. The traffic coming out the door is as important to inspect as that comes in, because the traffic coming out the door may be your sensitive data, or simply a very short command to a command and control network, which is going to bring down more tools or send an update for that piece of malware. When you can sever that command and control traffic, you have effectively isolated that piece of malware. It's ineffective, and that gives you time. Back to this concept of time. That means your teams, can have the time to go find that machine, clean it, without it posing a threat every second that it's operating. So command and control is a big deal. Blocking domains that are malicious, again, a lot of us do this today. But I think there's another piece to this. It's not just the malicious domain. Because malicious, when I say, oh, it's a malicious domain, how do you know that? Well, it's got a bad reputation. It's done bad things in the past. So a lot of our security tools use reputation heavily. Oh, does it have a bad credit record? Then let's not go there. But what about the brand new domain? You remember the statistic, second most popular activity for advanced threats, visit unregistered domains. We're talking about domains that have existed for less than 30 days. So that's another area that falls outside of reputation. It doesn't have a reputation. It hasn't done anything on the internet to gain a reputation. Therefore, again, it's going to bypass traditional security that relies on reputation. So perhaps it's a little bit too harsh to say block your users from going to unregistered or newly registered domains. That could be a little much because you might get too many complaints. But I think it is safe to say that you should block any files from coming down from those newly registered domains. So again, any solution you look at, make sure that it can distinguish not just bad reputation, but age of existence for that particular domain, and then enable a rule that says, if this thing's been in an existence for less than 30 days, don't let any files come down from it. I don't think your users will complain about that. And if they do, again, they're on the back alley of the internet. This is a proven high-risk area of the internet. So that's for your management to communicate to the users that's why the policy's in place. So the previous slide was all about the known threats. What do we do, though, with the unknown threats? How do we stop those? One of my favorite techniques is the sandbox. And it's not new. I mean, there's been sandboxing technologies out for quite some time, although, they're sometimes limited in terms of file types that they can cover or the speed at which they can cover. So certainly, if you want to take on the unknowns, or you have data in your network that is sensitive enough to care, then you need to investigate sandboxing technologies. And some of the things you should look for is a wide coverage of file types. And also, what happens with the information once the sandbox does the analysis? Because if you're relying on a technician to take that data from an open source sandbox, I promise you they will never keep up. Too many files. You'll miss things. Again, integrated security platform means that the threat prevention elements are communicating with each other. They're passing threat intelligence automatically such that your administrators are not snowed over with the analysis piece of this. One other nice thing happens here, and that's this idea that we want to be able to investigate applications that are unknown as well. Again, unknown traffic, unknown UDP, TCP, anything that can't be classified as a known application that we have allowed should be investigated. Because if you do this over time, it's an iterative process. What will be left is only bad things, and a very small bit, a manageable size of your network that you can do this analysis on. The idea of unknowns extends to users, and I think we do a fair job of this today. Authentication is coming a long way, but certainly have mechanisms in place that can control non-authorized or unknown users. because it still happens. And it's not just the contractor who plugs in or the guy in the parking lot that's on your Wi-Fi. But devices that come in, there's one step further that you could take with user authentication. And that is validate the device as well as the user. So in the previous example, I stole your passwords out of Internet Explorer. So now I am you. But if I actually do a system validation as well, system authentication, if you will, meaning I validate that the computer or the device that I'm trying to connect with those credentials is an approved device that we are aware of, we've approved. That next step would stop me from using the password I stole from you to do this, because I don't have your physical machine, I just have your login and password. So that's that next step that you can take, and it's not difficult. You know, some simple registry checks, host information profiling. A lot of products have this. This is one of those things that you buy it, but then you never use it. Well, okay, then don't be surprised when advanced attacks come and they set up shop and they live in your environment. You know, take that extra step and do it in such a way that it can be managed over time. That is to say, integrated security platform to automate this function. And then, of course, the idea of blocking unknown domains. I think we talked about that already. So dealing with the unknown is not impossible. It doesn't require that you have a huge security team. It just requires integrated security platform or integrated tools that are sharing threat intelligence. And sandboxing is a great way to do that. To detonate the file before it actually comes into your network, it's good. Because it's purely behavior then. I don't need to know, if I've seen it before. I just need to know how is it going to act once my user gets it. So at the end of this process, no matter how much security we deploy, and even if we took every one of these suggestions from before, and we're doing a great job now of making it very expensive for a determined adversary to attack our network. They still happen. They still happen. So acknowledge that these things will happen. Infections will happen. And be ready to be able to empower incident response teams, whether that's your own internal staff, whether that's your reseller, or you've got a security consultant. You need to be able to give them the forensics to do their job with. So again, any tools that you're going to invest in need to be able to provide the level of detailed forensics that will let these guys clean up your shop. And not just clean up that bug, but how do we verify that we really did clean it? Because like I said, number one behavior of evasion, long sleep. So I clean this machine, but these 5 are sleeping, waiting for me to think I'm done. And then in a week later, they're going to kick up. And then you have to pay the consultant some more. So if you give them the level of forensics, identify things like process stops and starts, file adds and deletes. What domains did they visit? So that you can track, specifically, okay, this is a subnet that contains the command and control for that particular bug. Here are the behaviors we saw. So now I can use just general system tools to find these same things on other machines. It helps the cleanup process to be complete. And so that you can really go home when you're done and know that everything's okay, and not worry that there's something sleeping in your network still. And after this is done, there's one other step that I think a lot of folks forget, because once the big scare is over, and once you're able to tell your boss, oh no, boss, it's clean, it's okay. Everybody just wants to go back to work, right? They don't want to think about it, the attack, the loss, whatever that loss might have been. But this is the exact time that you have to think about it. And that's when you revisit your policy. And that starts with the business policy. That's when management should sit down and go, okay, we've been too easy on this, we're too loose on this particular policy. If we'd have just turned it down just a little bit, none of this would have happened. Well, that's the time to do it, if ever, is right after an attack. Don't think you're done until you have gone full circle and found whatever gap in your security it was. And this doesn't mean go buy new things. It means have the tools that can adjust to policy changes easily. Now, last but not least, I think sharing the information. This is a relatively new concept. I'm not sure how much of it goes on in Chile. Very little goes on in the United States. But the idea that you've just been attacked and now you're going to tell the world how you were attacked. See, people don't like that. They don't want to air out their dirty laundry, do they? And there's a lot of legal reasons that you don't want to do that. And you've got competitors that will use that against you, right? So it's a scary idea. But we are seeing meaningful conversations starting in this very area. This idea of sharing threat intelligence. They call them ISOCs, information sharing, I forget the rest of the acronym, but financial services industry does this now in the US. Critical infrastructure is starting to do this. We're starting to see some new standards come out. And again, I don't know if there will be global standards, or, it's like with any new standard, it has to kind of gain adoption. And there's no one standard. But we're seeing things like, if you're interested in this area, there's a couple new protocols. STIX, a standardized threat intelligence transmission. Basically, it's like an XML representation of threat intelligence, threat actor intelligence, attack intelligence, all the various elements, not just the malware payload, but all of the elements around it. And then there are some transport protocols that, they haven't been adopted yet. But this is a key area, because what we're dealing with on the other side is a well-organized attacker. So if we are this disorganized, militia against this organized army, we're going to lose, like we've been losing the war in cyberspace thus far. So that unification, that federation, if you will, or confederation, is one method that may be what's necessary moving forward to be able to face down some of the most sophisticated, dedicated, organized attackers on the planet, sharing this intelligence. You see some of it today with vendors. They share the intelligence with other people who bought that product too. But I'm talking about industries and governments and schools. That's the level of collaboration that I think will be in the future. So to try to wrap this up a little bit here, this is a representation of the same attack lifecycle that we started the discussion with. And I've cross-referenced it here with some of the countermeasures. Again, whatever you're looking at for a solution to stop advanced persistent threat needs to address all phases of the attack lifecycle. It cannot just look at payload, and it cannot stay siloed. It cannot live onto itself and not share its intelligence with the rest of the system, or you'll lose the fight. And so as you look at some of the things that I think are important as terms of measures of quality, whatever system you choose, it needs to be able to adapt to business policy and security policy change easily. If management changes their mind on what users are allowed to do now or not allowed to do, it shouldn't take you all weekend. It shouldn't take you a week or more, which is true today. And this is true. You have hundreds of firewall rules. It can take you a long time to figure out how to take the new orders and turn them into tactical instruction sets for your countermeasures. It shouldn't have to take that long, because time is the other quality measure. Whatever solution you choose has to drastically reduce the amount of time that something is unknown to you. Unknown payloads, unknown applications, unknown domains. Because if you beat the clock, if you beat the malware clock, then you have a much, much, much better chance of winning the game. So that's all I have for you this afternoon. I will be around the conference. A lot of the source documentation that I mentioned in this, if you'd like copies of these things, I can provide them. Patricio is your local representative from Palo Alto Networks here in Chile. He lives in Santiago, and he'll be with me today as well. So again, thanks everyone for inviting me to the conference. It's been my honor to speak to you today. And good luck facing down the advanced threats